Hello and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So, Matt, who are we speaking to in this episode?
Hi, Liam. Well, I was lucky enough to sit down with Dr. Heather McKnight. She's the co-founder of the organization Magnetic Ideals, which is an organization focused on creative ways to bring together communities with the aim of fostering social change. It's an organization rooted in utopian ideals, and it offers a bridge between academics and activists, often on a kind of local level through things like climate cafes and workshops. Our discussion focused on the connection between utopian ideals and activism, an area that I have to admit, I had very little knowledge of prior to our conversation. So that I kind of found really interesting. And I actually I guess we could talk about this a little bit in a minute, but I got some sort of feelings of guilt really about this as a kind of utopian scholar or someone, I suppose, who'd like to claim themselves as a utopianist. That I've kind of had little engagement with activism beyond sort of trade unionism. And I think Heather, for example, gives a really great example of how activism needn't be this kind of huge, daunting thing. So, she sort of points out, I think, in the interview that while its implications are broad and sort of wide reaching in terms of its sort of abilities and capacities to promote change, actually like working at the local level and with small groups of people is really like the bedrock of activism and can kind of foster that mentality of change or at least a change in mentality. So yeah, so as a scholar who has one foot in the academic sphere and the other outside, she's able to offer that really sort of interesting perspective that maybe helps us go a little bit from that theoretical sort of side of utopia that we've been talking about quite a bit on the podcast so far to the kind of more practical sort of side of things. So sort of challenging maybe that myth that utopianists are sort of part of some elite circle, disconnected, if you like, from the practical implementation of their kind of ideas. So yeah, so our discussion, I think, shows that the utopian impulse toward collaboration actually translates really well into the field of activism. And yeah, I suppose I should also just encourage listeners to visit magneticideals.org if you want to see the kinds of projects that they get involved in. There's an awful lot there. It's a really interesting website, and yeah, I won't spoil it because obviously Heather talks a lot about some of those sort of initiatives in the interview, but I'll let her speak to them. But it's an interesting website.
Yeah, I think the interview for me was really lively, really engaging, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there about the myth that utopia and utopianism is either purely theoretical or is something that is inherently elitist and maybe locked away in the ivory tower of the academy. And so, sort of, if I was to sum up maybe the discussion in a pithy phrase, as I like to do, I sort of store it as utopian activism or grassroots utopianism. The idea that we can enact social change, in and around our communities, and seemingly, sort of based on what Heather's saying, having some really tangible outcomes there, some really positive outcomes there. And I even went on to Magnetic Ideals myself and had a look at some of the sort of workshops and activities that Heather and her collaborators run. And I can see how sort of real social change, in these sort of communities is taking place. And the sort of thing that, I think it's based down in Brighton. I sort of wish I was nearby so I could take part of it myself because it just sounded like a really great space to be engaging in.
Yeah, do you kind of feel that same sort of sense of guilt that I do about kind of, that or I mean, maybe you don't consider yourself a utopianist, Liam, I suppose, because you write about dystopia primarily, I suppose. But do you sort of at least sort of have that same sense of guilt that I know I do at not sort of maybe getting out to protest marches and these kinds of things as much as you'd like to, or
Yeah, it's hard in that, I've taken part on, a few picket lines and strikes in my time, whether that's, supporting sort of university lecturers whilst I was doing my doctorate, or I was the head of the student union when I was at college, and we had again, like lecturers strikes whilst I was doing that, and I was sort of there on the forefront of the picket line with them, because I really firmly believe that ultimately the people teaching us should be getting paid a fair wage and should be getting supported appropriately, because without them, what are we, the students, what are we getting? And I remember actually raising that at a National Union of Students conference. And I think, yeah, got quite mixed responses actually. I think when I sort of suggested that we should be supporting our lecturers as they're striking and we the students are missing out on our education, I sort of said, well, yes, we might be missing out on a week's worth of classes or a day's worth of classes, but is that not better in the grand scheme of things compared to losing talented educators overall? But yeah,
mm,
I maybe I'm not on the picket line as much as I should be or as much as I'd like to be. I have quite mixed feelings about how effective I think I feel the picket line can be and strike action is, which maybe is where, yes, I primarily come at utopias from a dystopian angle, and maybe that's where I'm slightly more pessimistic on their sort of their outcomes, I guess. But that's still coming from like a desire to see change, and to see sort of positive changes be made and implemented. So yeah, I don't know about guilt. It's really complex for me. My relationship's really complex. What about you, Matt? Where's your feelings of guilt? Do you want to talk to us a bit more about that? This is a safe
yeah, it's
space.
a
This is a
therapy
safe
session. Yeah,
space. Yeah, yeah.
therapy session. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe I've hid behind this idea that for a long time that educators, we teach students and they go out and they maybe they do the protesting on our behalf. I don't know. Probably shouldn't really think like that. I suppose we're also slightly in danger of sort of pushing the conversation in towards this sense that it is about picketing or it's about protesting only. And actually, I think what magnetic ideals are doing is much more kind of also sort of workshopping and things like that. There are other ways to go about kind of resisting or kind of or moving the dial. I think that Heather talks about that aren't necessarily stood on a picket line. So I suppose I should point that out. But I think I'm personally, I've been really fascinated by this idea that comes from a writer called Bruce Robbins. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called The Sweatshop Sublime. I think it kind of does a lot to explain how I feel, or not how I feel, but maybe explain why we kind of respond to these kind of more radical ideas in the kind of fashion that we do. Is it something you've heard of?
No, not at all. Yeah, tell me more.
I'll start with the example that he gives, which is basically he sort of describes an average morning for most people, which is sort of you go downstairs or whatever, you put your kettle on to make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. I don't drink tea or coffee, so it's a bit of a strange as analogy for me. But anyway, it's a good one nevertheless. But he sort of points out that then if you sort of stop and think about it, you're thinking about the kettle and you have this momentary kind of realization that all the sort of things around you are connected to this sort of web of kind of consumerism that draws kind of resources from all over the world to come together to produce this sort of cup of coffee for you, whatever. Maybe you got fancy beans, I don't know. But he also sort of gives another example, which is your t-shirt. So in the morning, you put your t-shirt on, and just on one occasion, you stop and you look at the label, the back of your shirt, and it says something like, made in Bangladesh or whatever, and you think just for that moment, you realize your sort of complicity in the global kind of, the global movements of capitalism and consumerism. And this, he sort of suggests, could be, or maybe even should be, a kind of transformative moment because suddenly you're sort of transported, halfway across the world, at least in your mind. And there's a certain power in that, right? I mean, the fact that we can have these sort of products shipped halfway across the world at our whim for us to just chuck on the t-shirt without thinking about it, switch the kettle on without thinking about it. It's kind of a powerful moment. It's sort of a testament, if you like, um, to human ingenuity, human development. But actually, the result is, what do we actually do? Well, we put that
Mm.
t-shirt on and we just carry on with our day. Okay, we sort of put it back into its box, if you like. We're almost afraid of that encounter, so we occasionally have it. And he sort of talks about it in relation to the sort of the notion of the sublime, that sort of you're encountering this sort of terrifying, massive thing that is just beyond your kind of scope of comprehension, and that this moment actually pacifies us politically, because we end up sort of thinking, well, what difference can I make? What can I do? What difference is it going to make if I go and stand on that picket line, for example, or go and march on that protest? I'm going to be drowned out by the world, or whatever. So I think that's I think it's a really powerful way of thinking about it. It really sort of helps explain, I suppose, I think why a lot of people are quite apathetic about
Mhm.
activism. Um, but that doesn't solve the problem, does it? And I think he talks about sort of corporations, and we can kind of think about all corporations as kind of evil, and these kind of entities like that, but it doesn't actually help us. We don't actually get anywhere closer towards change by doing that. So yeah, I often think about this idea when I'm thinking about my own kind of involvement in these things and my own complicity. um so yeah, that's an idea I like to use in my classes sometimes, and when I teach globalization, because I think it kind of helps us think about uh, you know the little details in our lives, I suppose, that
Mm.
you just every now and again notice, and just makes you think.
Am I right in thinking then, like this idea? It's these are things that feel so huge and enormous, and we struggle to sort of dismantle them. Perhaps, I don't know if even if I chucked away my phone, I don't think that's going to completely cease the production of all these microchips in
Apple's
terrible,
not going to
terrible.
care. I'm not
No.
sure if I mean, you might not have an Apple phone, but yeah, your point, I suppose, is that what difference can your opting out of the system really make? What is it other than a kind of token of
Mm.
resistance?
But
But
but then
but
is that where these like small acts that Heather and the Magnetic Ideals sort of collective do? That's where we can enact change. That's sort of more liberating and more empowering. Then is that sort of what we're thinking here?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I was going, broadly speaking, is that sort of sense that, well, what she's getting at is something smaller that we can do, that isn't really like about, it is resisting, but it's not resisting to affect the will of organizations and companies and nations. Actually, it's much more about sort of opting out of something, and in doing so, sort of changing hearts and minds, small mentalities, things that you can manage, enjoying those things, like going to
Mm.
a climate cafe, for example, because you want to have enjoyable conversations with people. It's not something you're punishing yourself with. It's something you're actually getting something out of it. It's kind of making me think of Cory Doctorow's novel A Walk Away, actually, which I
Mhm.
read relatively recently, which I thought was really interesting. This sort of idea of just packing up and walking away from everything is like this big kind of statement in of itself, but it's also something you can enjoy. This
Mhm.
idea that actually walking away from stuff doesn't have to be a punishment. You're not punishing yourself, but there's other communities out there that can be quite pleasurable. And yeah, I suppose we were kind of almost going back to sort of our conversation with Raffaella Bacalini right at the beginning of the series, and this idea of walking away from Omelas, for
Mhm.
example. We don't actually know what we're walking toward. It doesn't have to be that we're walking towards something worse, or something dystopian. So yeah, I think absolutely. Going back to Heather's interview, I think that's what she's sort of showing us, I suppose, is that it doesn't have to be so daunting. It's that kind of little acts of resistance that can really, make a difference on a personal level as
Mhm.
well, and made it feel, at least to me, a little bit more accessible than this
Yeah.
kind of idea of, well, I have to go on all these kind of protest marches, and I have to, give up my phone or whatever. I have to, can't drive anywhere. These kinds of things. It makes it feel a little bit more manageable.
Yeah. Making activism, I guess, making activism more utopian in that it is still enacting change, but it's joyful, rather than like punitive. Matt, I'm aware that we could probably go on about this and have this discussion for ages, and I'm sure we will once we're off recording. But I'm also aware that we probably need to give Heather her space to share her ideas. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. Hit that button, Liam.
I'm hitting the
Roll
button,
roll
and
the tape.
and here comes the jingle.
So I'm delighted to have with us today Dr. Heather McKnight. Heather, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on this podcast. It's a real privilege to be here. I kind of work between academia and the community sector. I'm not officially affiliated to any university, but work with a collective called Magnetic Ideals and also some other community organisations, although I still present at academic conferences and publishing some academic work as well. I got my PhD in law from the University of Sussex, where I wrote my thesis on reimagining the university through resistance, very much looking at utopianism and activism, and specifically the potential of joint working between trade unions and students' unions in order to transform some of the problems that we might see day to day in the university. At the moment, I'm kind of what could be described as an independent academic or community researcher. So my current research looks at kind of collective care in the community. I run spaces of collective care, such as creative climate cafes and menopause cafes, and also doing a piece of research on hygiene poverty with a community laundrette in Brighton called Harriet's Press, which works at the kind of intersection between hygiene poverty and the arts, because they do arts work with people while they're doing their laundry, and they offer free laundry service. So it's almost like these kind of spaces of practical utopias, where people are trying to do things differently and trying to make things better, I guess. Uh, Not that you can never really do that in a way that isn't complicit, I think, which is interesting.
I'm sure we might come back to that idea actually a little bit later, but that's really interesting. So you're kind of working in these little pockets, and they're all quite diffuse by the sounds of it, which can be varied, interesting. I think one of the reasons we wanted to get you on the podcast really was to give us that little bit of something different, not something that's just us batting around theory the whole time, and this is much more sort of connected to what's really going on. And I suppose on a personal level, and I think I've written about this a little bit recently. I feel a bit guilty because I'm not someone who's in activism. I don't sort of go out on protest marches and things like that. And I kind of sometimes feel a bit like, well, can I really be a so-called utopianist if I'm not sort of involved in that? So I kind of look at that as like the real sort of work being being done by you, if you like, whereas I'm kind of a bit of a pretender. So yeah, what do you think about that in general? Is that, I mean, what does utopia mean to you, for example? Is it about sort of activism, or is it kind of theoretical in some senses?
For me, I think I take a Blockian approach. So it is about the material work in the real world, but I mean, his work is also about understanding the darkness of the lived moment. And I very much come from that kind of darkness of the lived moment utopianist. And you need the research to understand that as well. Um, and I think that there is it's almost like that kind of guilt, it gets in the way of hope, and creating those links and understanding those links between academia and theory and literature and film and media, and how that inspires and impacts on and affects the real world, and how we break down those barriers in order that theory can get from the university, theory and ideas and ways of disrupting things can get out of the university and into the community. We need everyone doing lots of different jobs in order for that to happen. I sometimes struggle myself to see myself as a real activist because I feel that perhaps when I was younger, I did a lot more, kind of practical protesting, being in unions. And one of the things of being outside of the universities being quite strange is still occasionally writing a bit, still writing a bit about precarity in universities and unions. And like how long can I stay outside and still write about that? Do you need to really be inside to write on that? So it's all very, I think we should see it as complicated and messy, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful to lay guilt on ourselves, or when, especially when things are so busy and difficult within the university. And to challenge the system makes you more precarious within the system. And some of the work that I'm doing, it was actually a couple of years ago, which is with the European Association for Social Anthropologists. There's a piece of research I did with them 2 years ago that's only just being released now, that's about anti-precarity work at the end of the month. And it's taken 2 years because it's all precarious academics trying to pull together and organize the launch of this research that looks at how anti-precarity work.
Can I just ask, it feels a bit like it's sort of an unusual marriage in some way, perhaps, or it might seem like that, this idea of sort of utopian studies and kind of activism. How did you kind of first get involved in utopian studies? What drew you to utopia and utopian studies in particular?
I think where I've ended up in a kind of like a non-traditional area is because I kind of came into academia in a very untraditional way. I started university very young and dropped out, so I don't actually have an undergraduate degree. But I guess in retrospect, a lot of the work I started working for charities, public sector, ended up working in students' unions, and that was because I went back to study music, tried to get an undergraduate, didn't. So I ended up working for a students' union where I had the opportunity to do an MA with a fee waiver. And I was like, what an amazing opportunity. I might as well see if they'll take me on. And they did. And it was a philosophy master's. And I was completely out of my depth. And I was picking up books on Kant, so like foreign language. And I found a lot of the critical theory was so overwhelmingly negative. And this is the darkness of the living moment, isn't it? So it's quite a utopian way to come into utopia. But it was, so I felt like a lot of it backed itself into a corner, that a lot of the discussions that we had on philosophy and a lot of the critiques were just critiques. They weren't about the actual practical world building. How do we change this? How do we tackle this? Because whenever you came up with any idea, people would just be pulling it apart because that's what we're being taught to do.
Yeah.
And then I saw on Jiscmail this book just called The Privatization of Hope. And I was like, that's really interesting. No one's talking about hope here. And it was a book edited by Peter Thompson and Slavoj Žižek about Ernest Bloch, who I hadn't heard anything about. And then I went and managed to acquire the, as I think we mentioned just at the end of the last podcast, The Principle of Hope, which is an expensive purchase.
Large as well, yeah.
Yes,
Large
and
volume.
it took me a very, very long time even to digest small parts of it. But I found it really opened things up, and it opened up how I could look at these other critical theorists, and I could read the horizons of hope within their work and view them very, very differently. I was working a lot with Foucault and Butler and Agamben at that point.
That's
So
really interesting to me on the level that I try to tell students early on, and I've only just recently been doing, because I've been teaching a first year under a graduate module, which is sort of a skills-based module. And one of the first things we talk about is that what is criticism, and criticism by its name and nature sort of implies this sort of this idea that you are critiquing something, you're finding the flaws in it, the problems. So it's inherently a kind of negative process. But I always kind of tell them, well, that's not actually really what we want you to do. I don't think that's what academic criticism should be. We want to write about things that we love and that we're interested in, and that provide inspiration. And so I kind of I'm with you on that. I think one of the people I tend to talk about is Oscar Wilde, in that sort of sense that for him, your criticism was something that actually made the artwork new, or kind of produced a new work of art. So it was about re-evaluating, reappreciating that work of art, and creating something entirely new from it through criticism. And I always think that's quite an inspiring way of thinking about it. So yeah, so you obviously had that, I guess, that sort of similar sort of sense that some criticism, at least some criticism, feels like quite like, well, why bother? If something's that upsetting for you, just don't bother with it. There's better things to do with your time, kind of thing.
Yeah. Although it took me back to the works that I'd read that I was finding unhelpful, I think, or as a bit like, yes, I see the point. We are complicit, we are manipulated, we are trapped, and we need to understand this. And I think with what Bloch says is we need to understand how dark things are. And one of my favorite pieces of writing by him is in The Spirit of Utopia, where he talks about how like disgusted we should be about ourselves as academics, to see us as to want to vomit and things, and for a piece of utopian writing. But then he comes around to kind of like, who are we to think we can work? Who are we to think we can do anything? But then it's like, but we start from where we are. And I think that's with activism, with trying to change things that seem impossible to change. That's why I think Bloch's work's really important, because it comes right back when he writes like from the like movement from hunger to hope. And he says, like, for example, Freud starts too far along the line. We need to be thinking about, right, kind of how people move, kind of need to be thinking about everyone. And that really kind of, we're born with that kind of hope that we're going to live from one moment to the next. It's very much how I came to, and it was a really grounding experience, kind of like finding his work, because
Mm.
it felt like kind of a journey through that. It felt like a way to this idea of kind of being and becoming utopian. I think particularly that Tom Moylan's wrote about in his last book as well. That's that we're always in process, and that utopia isn't a destination, it's a process. Although I think that I've possibly I started with it just as a process, and then I've gone to looking at things like Foucault's heterotopias, Foucault's heterotopia, where and the idea of micro utopias, which are ephemeral temporal spaces. So utopia is a kind of space time, it's
Mm.
um
Yeah, I
so
think I sort of I vaguely remember reading something by Gregory Clays about sort of Saturnalia as an example of how you can have these these sort of moments of kind of utopia that are outside of and but also work to kind of challenge the structures as well. So I think
yeah.
that's a nice way of thinking about it, way in which sort of Saturnalia sort of upends the kind of dominant hierarchical structures. But then, you can be quite cynical about that, and you can kind of also say, well, that also performs your kind of anti-establishment sort of sentiment, and kind of repackages it and sort of makes it safe. And so you can also take that in quite a cynical fashion, I suppose. I just wanted to go back a little bit to your work with magnetic ideals. Yeah, how did that come about then? Because you've talked a bit about sort of your work with student unions, and then you've co-founded this organization. How did that come about?
Well, I mean, it's been running. It's strange thing. It's been running for in January it'll be 10 years, and I mean, it came about because I used to work in the charity sector. The idea kind of came about in when I still lived up in Edinburgh. I'm down in Brighton now, and I was working for charities, and charities were all. It's almost like charities were always needing support and to bring in people to do bits and pieces of work with them, but it was always like these kind of consultancy firms that that existed that seemed to exploit charity, and
Yeah.
so I was like, there's room for like an ethical organizations that work with and in partnership to charities, to not to necessarily charge them, but to help them fund, like to co-fundraise with them and things like that. So there was an idea around that. And when I moved into Brighton, there was a lot of people. I stepped into it because I decided to work self-employed after completing my MA, and and to work self-employed students unions. And I had a lot of friends who were artists, activists, researchers, who were all trying to do the same thing. But it's quite much like doing a PhD, I guess. Kind of working self-employed can be quite isolated, quite lonely. And so we formed a collective, and it was something that we could work together on. We can have shared email address, a shared identity, but actually we're still free agents, able to do what we want. We can work together in partnership. We coalesce over ideas like we've been doing a lot of work around eco-anxiety as well, because that was an idea that, and then we just get together and be like, what can we do around this? What does this mean? What can we try and do? Which is where the idea of creative climate cafes came about. So, there's basically an existing model of climate cafes that's copyrighted, where people are trained to facilitate spaces where adults can come together and talk about climate grief and climate anxiety, in a hope that that allows them to then, I guess, be more active outside of those spaces, or at least be able to cope with their own anxiety around climate. Um, and but we wanted to bring an artistic element to it, because not everyone can always talk, and talking can be very difficult. And we also wanted to make it so it could be intergenerational as well, not just because that's so that there are spaces people could bring their kids to and things. So, um, and we also have another project called Welcome to the Swamp, which looks at creating workshops where people can kind of experience themselves as being with nature, as part of nature, and
Is
hoping.
that like a counter to draining the swamp? Is that the idea of
Absolutely.
the create the swamp? I like it. I like the name a lot.
And, and swamps are liminal utopian spaces. They're
Mm.
neither land nor water, so they're
Oh,
um,
excellent. If anyone listening to this is someone who wants to maybe get involved, is there kind of ways they can get involved in magnetic ideals?
I mean, if people are interested, they can, yeah, I mean, they can just go on the website, drop me an email. I mean, we're not like a member organization that has fees or anything. We just find people who work in partnership with them. And we do that in lots of different ways. There's, I want, I've mentioned one, a couple of the projects we've done, but we've um, worked with homeless charities, putting on exhibitions for homeless artists. Um, we've worked also on stuff to do with higher education. When the Student Engagement Partnership existed, we worked with them looking at how students um, engaged with influencing the university through quality structures. But obviously, we were trying to bring our utopian creative lens to it. So we were engaging people in creative ways of feeding back and questioning things like the research ethics, because it's quite often students become the subject of research in order to improve and enhance education. But there can be, and I'm not saying always, but a slackness around research ethics around how that is done.
Mm.
And so trying to kind of question, query, and critique some of these things and say, how can these be things that make the university better, rather than how do these become things that just add to the managerial structures
Yeah,
that
I
are
suppose
oppressive?
there's a temptation, isn't there, to ask leading questions in these kinds of things, and you want certain responses. So yeah, or you only survey about certain things. Yeah, yeah, interesting. Can
Like,
we talk a little bit about sort of activism a minute? Go back to that, I suppose, because
yeah,
I wondered if, from my perspective, utopianism and activism sort of go hand in hand, but there's also like a kind of strand of, I suppose, negativity around that kind of term utopia. And, I wondered whether you'd kind of maybe encountered any sort of sort of, activists who sort of, well, what about Utopia's got that kind of negative reputation, totalitarian, dictatorial, all those kinds of connections. I wondered whether you'd encountered negativity, or whether maybe people that you've met in that circle actually really embrace sort of utopianism in some capacity.
Yeah, well, I mean, having worked in this what ended up being a very strange space, a complicated ethically space. When I finished my PhD, I had, obviously, much like most people, a fixed idea it was going to be, interviews, archival work, great. And then the strikes happened, and I was like, I can't not write on this. And I'm in this, and I'm in the union, and I'm connected with the students' union. And obviously, in order to write about it, I had to speak to the people who write about me, about my research, because if you are there's an absolute conflict of interest that I had to work through. Was I am doing academic work on the picket line if I am an insider researcher researching this picket as it's happening? And where is that boundary? How do people want to be represented? And so I had a lot of discussions about what I was doing with other activists to make sure they were comfortable with what I was doing and the ethics of it.
And
Because I was
how you
feeling
were
very
representing
uncomfortable.
it, presumably, how you were representing that space. They wanted to see it represented as they sort of felt it existed, in some sense.
Yeah, yeah, and I felt like I had to be very, very open. I had to be very open about my theoretical basis, my personal biases, intentions, and all my work said, like, I don't believe you can write about this in an unbiased way, and I'm not, this is where I'm starting from, um and the activists I let activists read my PhD chapters, but like, your supervisor would, to get their feedback on the representation, which is very exposing. But I also was, I learned a lot through that. Um, And I actually didn't find doing that the utopia, that people were resistant to the idea of utopia. I also did some teach outs looked at um, that looked at kind of utopian thinking in relation to um, kind of protest and activism. And I think that because of the particular approach to utopianism I'm taking, I didn't really get that resistance. You're saying utopia is a process, and particularly if you're looking at ideas such as educated hope, and how we educate each other on the picket line just by being around each other, how we learn just by being in that space from each other, how we learn to hope. We learn that its possibility to change. I mean, the amount of people, the transformation that happened to people that were picketing was quite interesting. People rethinking their careers in academia completely. I'm sure a lot of people will, they're just like, this is people meeting people from different parts of the institution they would never have met before, connections, new projects flourishing. And when you're talking to people about utopia being this open thing as opposed to a closed system, and it being something that is about kind of critique as well, instead of perfection, um, but also about like this possibility. It's grounded in the idea that change, for a better future, is possible. It's not necessarily likely. I don't know. It's not a but it's more possible the more people that are working towards it, collectively hoping, sharing their ideas.
Yeah, I think Tom Moylan in particular has obviously written a lot about the connection between utopia and activism, and I think in particular the idea that utopianism offers not just hope, but actually it's the kind of radical nature of that hope that I think he sort of is interested in. Something that he sort of, I think, describes as needed in the face of basically a kind of radical pessimism that we kind of get embedded in today's politics. So it strikes me at least that that activism by its nature is utopian, so you found actually you found a lot of people that sort of shared that sentiment, when even if maybe they weren't describing it as
Mm.
utopianism, or they weren't sort of describing themselves as utopianist. You found actually that there was quite a lot of resonance there. Is that Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Tom Mann has been a huge influence in how I've kind of looks at Bloch, or looks at yeah, kind of activism as well, from a utopian standpoint, and that in activism can be seen in that way of kind of becoming utopian within that as well. I actually found more resistance to the idea of utopianism within academia when you mention it
Right.
sometimes, that people
Interesting.
are
Yeah.
quite dismissive of it. And again, this I think what you mentioned before, this idea that I that somehow to critique is just to pull things apart and prove that you know that they're wrong, or that you can criticize them.
Yeah, that
I
becomes
did
like
think.
a quite cynical, doesn't it? Because it's about showing how intelligent you are. I
Mhm.
always again I always think cynicism is easy, right? That's, you know, some people think it's a mark of intelligence to sort of say, well, you know, if you vote for X government, they're just going to be just as bad. Everyone's the same, and this kind of thing. And I think, well, yeah, okay, but that's just really easy. That doesn't actually involve anything. It doesn't help anything. Doesn't improve things. It's much more difficult to offer constructive ideas and positive sort of like blueprints and these kinds of things. So utopianism is more difficult in that sense, but more rewarding, I think.
Actually, I think this kind of brings us. I don't know if this is onto that idea of like failure in utopia, because I think it's a lot more scary to try something and have it fail. But that's what, then to sit back and go, well, that'll never work.
Mm,
And chances are things that you try will fail. And looking at, kind of activists, marches, protests, on the surface, you can look at them and go, it's very easy to go, oh, well, that didn't work, that didn't work.
mm,
But what comes out of it and how they sustain future movements, and the training that activists have had maybe for a particular event, or to be part of a particular organization or society or whatever, that and how that can go on to affect what they, kind of a student that's been trained in student activism, how that'll affect what they do later on in life, and whether they're going within the university or out with, what they get involved with and continue to do, and the way they act and be in the workplace, and there's so many ways in which like activism kind of activates and educates hope and utopianism.
it's a good time to talk about what you're working on then. What are you currently working on, Heather? If you don't mind
Um,
me asking.
Yeah. Currently, actually, one of the networks I've been really involved with is kind of to do with utopian failure. And what I've been um, starting to do some writing about is what I've called cafe culture and failure, and utopia. And by cafe culture, I think I touched on earlier the idea of these kind of spaces where people come together to talk and share experiences. um, and they're kind of quasi-therapeutic spaces, and they're usually free spaces as well, in a space where I don't pressures on the NHS mean people can't access mental health services, they can't access support, and certainly not therapy generally, with any form of ease. So the different cafes that I looked at within that are like the death cafes, grief cafes, climate cafes, and menopause cafes. So these are all points, if you think like kind of death, grief, the climate crisis, and menopause. The points are seen as failure in some ways. Death is a failure of the human body, or failure of us to keep going. Um, Grief is a, kind of, it as a process of dealing with it, is point of failure. The menopause, rightly or wrongly, is seen as a kind of almost like medical failure of the body, and also the climate crisis is one of the biggest kind of failures we could see. But so starting from, again, this idea of darkness to lift moment, what happens within these spaces is people come together and they talk and they share and they transform, or well they can. And so it's looking at what does it mean to come together and explore these failures and create new ideas of moving forward through them? What comes out of the conversation, even if it's just one person feeling better or different or able to continue, or is it a new project, an idea, a piece of research because people have been brought together? And a recent conference the network ran up in Newcastle, we did an academic care cafe. I think academia perhaps is some of the ways that we've touched upon is a space where failure is happening because of managerialism, neoliberalism. And we literally built give people a space where they could build a university out of rubbish, out of we invited people to bring marketing materials from their own institutions. We had loads of cardboard boxes. We had people crawling through cardboard boxes to, as a process kind of thing. It was but it was a space. It was meant to be a playful space where people could talk to each other about their experiences, as well as opening up ideas and possibilities for new ways of working.
As a sign off, I'm asking everyone, every guest we've had, sort of to name a text. Could be a novel, movie, piece of criticism, a TV show, even, perhaps for yourself, something about Utopia that you think everyone should read or watch. Have you got any suggestions for people?
I've been really struggling with this question. I have a few different things here, and I'm trying to decide.
If you need more than one, I think I gave someone else two. So
I know.
fine.
I've just tried to. I think there's Davina Cooper's Everyday Utopias, which and she works on this idea of prefigurative law making. It does some really interesting methodological stuff around that. And she looks at kind of feminist spaces of potentiality and how they can transform things. So that's very much looking at some micro utopias and defining micro utopias. So I think I could go with that. That's one.
I've not heard of it, so I'll have to look that up. As I said, I think on previous podcast episodes, this is becoming sort of the list will just keep growing and growing of things that I need to add to my Goodreads. But that one does sound interesting and kind of develop some of the things we've been discussing. So that's great. Thanks, Heather. It's been fantastic having you on and been really refreshing, lovely different sort of dimension and perspective on kind of utopia. Although you very much talked about theoretical sort of angles, but utopia in terms of its connection to the world and kind of how we might sort of view it in relation to our own participation in that world and our own participation in utopianism itself through activism. So I thought that was great. Thanks very much, for coming on. And I hope to see you again soon.
I'm sure you'll join me in echoing Matt as I thank Heather for her time. Hearing more about the connection between utopianism and activism, how we can use theory as a mobilising force to enact real-world change, and her work with magnetic ideals was absolutely fantastic. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow the podcast and rate it on your podcasting platform of choice, or you could even send us an email with your thoughts. We've got loads more interesting interviews coming soon, so please do join us next time as we explore more utopian and dystopian fictions.